It's the FA Cup final this weekend, and that means we're going to see a game between Manchester United and Manchester City. Now, the last time these two teams played back in January, it was a very different situation. Manchester United were on the up, Manchester City were stuttering in the league, and in the end, Manchester United actually won that game. But since then, things have gone quite differently, not least in terms of the starting 11s. So on the board in front of me, I've got the two teams from that game back in January. The first thing to notice for Manchester City is how different their starting 11 is. So we can see here Joao Cancelo is on the team. He has since gone on loan to Bayern Munich, so hasn't been playing for the rest of the season for City. And then in the wide positions, we've got Phil Foden and Riyad Mahrez, who haven't really played in those positions ever since this point. We've also got Bernardo Silva in the middle. And then on the bench here, Gundogan, Stones, Diaz and Grealish, who have all played really significant parts in the second half of the season for Manchester City. But it's not just the starting 11 that are different. Manchester City actually played in a very different way in that game, and we can see that on the board here. So what we can see, Manchester City building up in this direction down the field, and they're playing with a flat back four. You can see the ball here with Nathan Ake. We've got Rodri as a single pivot, and then the 2-8s here of Silva and De Bruyne, and here's Erling Haaland dropping in, and then the two wide players offering width off screen. And this makes a certain degree of sense because, as we can see, Manchester United have a front three press here. They're going to press up against the Manchester City back line here, and because, as you can see, it's quite narrow, there is the possibility that if you play a really wide back four, you can manipulate the ball around your back line and actually find yourself in these spaces with the ball, able to progress it down the field. Another thing to notice is that Manchester United have gone player to player across the midfield, so they've got two 6s up against the Manchester City 8s, and then you can see here Eriksen is keeping Rodri quiet in the middle. And this is what it looks like on the tactics board then. So we've got the front three here up against the Manchester City back four. And it's worth noting that in this forward line then of the build-up where Manchester City have the ball, there is an overload for Manchester City. That means they have an extra player in that front line, which means that Manchester United will end up having a weakness when they are trying to press the Manchester City back line. Elsewhere across the midfield, we can see that Manchester United are matching Manchester City player for player. So we have a 10 on the 6, and then we have two 8s on the two Manchester City 6s as well. So this matches up really nicely. And elsewhere, you can keep two players on Haaland because he's a really dangerous player, and then your fullbacks go on the wide player. But we've talked about how there is going to be a weakness when Manchester United press. Why does that happen? Well, let's imagine that Ake has the ball from the goalkeeper here, and what we're going to see is we're going to see Martial curving his run here to make life difficult for Ake. Fernandes is going to go across to Cancelo. Rashford is going to pull in here to Akanji, and that means that we have a player here, Kyle Walker, who is left in space. So everywhere else across the pitch, Manchester United are tracking their players, and they have double coverage over here on Haaland because he's the dangerous player. But that means that Walker is left free, and this is what Manchester City are going to try and exploit in their build-up. Now, it is interesting to note that for most elite teams who are going to do this kind of high press where they're trying to go man-to-man against the back line, they probably wouldn't leave this weakness here. What they would do is they would push one of their fullbacks up in order to cover that option so you can't work the ball around easily, find this player in space and then progress the ball. But actually what this does is it introduces another weakness. So what you're doing is you're leaving Mahrez free in this situation, and the solution to that would usually be that you would move one of your centre-backs across and the other centre-back would cover the centre-forward. But what you've done here is that you've actually left three players, 1v1 along the back line. And as we've seen from Erik Ten Hag, he really doesn't like that kind of uncertainty in his back line, particularly because if you're pressing the opposition in the front line here, it's a very easy ball for them to play over the top, and now you just have a 1v1 Haaland versus Varane, and you're trying to get into that foot race in behind. Haaland is a very physical player, Varane a very good defender, but you're making it much harder for him to defend in that situation. So what they're going to try and do is move the ball around until they get into a position where Walker has the ball in front of him, he can push forward, and the idea is that you should then be able to generate some kind of dangerous situation. And that's exactly what happened in that game back in January, early on in the first half. So in this screenshot here, we can see Manchester City building up this way down the field. They pass the ball around their back line, and they've been able to manipulate the Manchester United forward press so that they're all on the opposite side of the field, quickly move the ball back across, and we can see here Cancelo has the ball at his feet with a lot of space to get into. And we can see Fernandes here, who's playing on the outside of that front three, has been across pressing in this area. He now has to come across and try and beat Cancelo in a foot race. And then we can see this is Casemiro here with Bernardo Silva. He has to mark him tightly, and you can see Silva is pulling him out the way, and that gives them the license to just move the ball down in this wide area and get a really good attacking chance away. So if we fast forward the tape a little bit, we can see that that ball ends up at the feet of Bernardo Silva, who's got ahead of Casemiro here. This is really not a very nice sight if you're a Manchester United player, because he's going to get a direct line into goal. You can see David De Gea just scrambling a little bit here. This is really not a nice defensive situation, and it's not just happening on this side of the pitch, we can see it happening on the far side of the pitch as well. So here's Kyle Walker again. You can see he's been able to progress the ball in this wide area completely unopposed. This is a fairly dangerous situation in the end, he actually plays quite a poor pass and Manchester City can't benefit from it. But what we're seeing is that Manchester City are able to exploit those wide areas, move the ball down the line, and actually caused Manchester United some problems in the first part of the first half. But as the half wore on, Manchester United found some solutions to those problems of allowing space in the wide areas, and that was that they were going to move their midfield players out to help out in those situations. So again, this is 7 minutes into the game, so this is still fairly early on. What we can see here is Casemiro, who should be marking one of the two eights. We can see the two eights here. They've actually swapped sides, so Silva is over here and De Bruyne is over here. Casemiro should be keeping an eye on Kevin De Bruyne, and then we can see Fred keeping an eye on Bernardo Silva over here. So what we can see here is Joao Cancelo has managed to progress the ball in that wide area, but rather than allowing him further forward, what we can see is Casemiro has moved across into this space here to stop him. Now Casemiro is keeping an eye on one of the eights, and you can see Fred is keeping an eye on one of the other eights over here. But in this instance, what's happened is that Eriksen, who is one of the 10s who's supposed to be keeping an eye on Rodri, has dropped in to help out with the eights. And we can see Bruno Fernandes here has dropped in to make sure that the ball then can't go back to Rodri. So Manchester United are able to solve this problem by making sure they're starting to overload the centre of the pitch with their midfielders to make it harder for Manchester City to benefit from these sorts of areas. So by the time half-time comes around, it's clear that Pep Guardiola no longer thinks that he's getting any advantages from trying to build up in those wide areas. Manchester United are able to close his team down, and so what he decides to do is try and build up through the middle instead. So this is a screenshot from early on in the second half, and Manchester City are now building up in this direction. We can notice a couple of things in particular, one of which is Rodri now is dropping from his central midfield situation in between the two centre-backs here. So we can see he's pulled Christian Eriksen out of the way here. And then the other thing to notice is that both of the fullbacks now are inverting. They're coming inside the pitch. And as you can see, Marcus Rashford has come inside with Kyle Walker. And we can see Joao Cancelo over here pulling Bruno Fernandes with him. So if he can't build in the wide areas, then he's going to have to build through the middle. But there's a problem here, and that is that if you look at this central space, you can see that actually Manchester United players are really overloading on the Manchester City players, making it really hard to actually progress the ball through the middle. So something needs to change. And as we've seen already from that screenshot before, there's two different things that happen. One of those things is that Rodri drops in between the two centre-backs in possession. Why would he do that? Well, because he's being man-marked, so he's going to pull Eriksen with him. And we notice that across the other two midfielders, they're also being quite tightly man-marked, so they can move into other areas as well. So let's say De Bruyne moves out wide and pulls Fred with him, and Silva moves out wide and pulls Casemiro with him. Now what we've done is actually opened a huge amount of space in the middle, but there's no one here to exploit it. And that's why the second thing happens. That's why the fullbacks are inverting. So we see Walker and Cancelo coming inside, again, filling that space, and they're able to exploit the space that has been opened up. Now obviously this way of generating space in the middle relies on the Manchester United players tracking their men, and obviously if Rodri is going to pull out here, Eriksen might not always track him all the way. But the point of all of this interchange and movement between the Manchester City players is that it's going to pull the Manchester United players all over the place, introduce confusion about who's marking who, and actually generate space in here that can be exploited, so that you're now able to start putting these kinds of balls in behind for players like Haaland, and it becomes much more dangerous. And this is exactly what happened for the Manchester City goal in that game. Mahrez ends up with the ball in the wide area here. Kevin De Bruyne is running through the half space, has the pass played to him, and he's able to make his way into the box, play the ball over the back, straight to Jack Grealish, who actually heads the ball in. And Manchester City were 1-0 up. Now you'll say to me, well, in the end, Manchester United did end up winning that game. And that is true, but they did rely on a very interesting goal, which everyone thought was offside, turned out not to be offside. Manchester United got a little bit of a momentum, and they were able to go 2-1 up when they got a chance through Garnacho on the break. But the point is that in the second half, Manchester City were able to cause Manchester United more problems in possession. Now, since that point, things have changed a lot for Manchester City, because they now play a very different formation. They've now started playing straight up in their 3-2-5 shape, and they're starting off, rather than having a fullback inverting from the outside, they're starting off with a central midfielder who can drop out of play. In this instance, John Stones, who's a centre-back, so he's going to drop into the back line in defensive moments. But in possession, what's going to happen is that Manchester City are going to look like this from the off when the goalkeeper has the ball kicking out from the back. And we've also seen a lot of changes in terms of their personnel. So we've now got Kyle Walker and Manuel Akanji playing as outside centre-backs. Ruben Dias has been brought in as a centre-back, and as we've said, Stones can drop in and help out in those defensive moments, and he's going to sit the rest of the time alongside Rodri. But then in the forward line, we've now got Silva playing out wide because he's really dangerous out of possession, and we've got Grealish, who's had a really good second half of the season. Gundogan is now playing the 8 because Silva's over here, and then as usual we have Haaland and De Bruyne. So the big question is, how do Manchester United respond to this shape change by Manchester City, which has made them so dangerous in the second half of the season? So let's just have a think about what Manchester United's current structure would look like against that new Manchester City shape. Now, the big thing is that Manchester City have gone from having a back four in their build-up phase against Manchester United back in January to having a shape which is now a back three. And this changes that weakness that we talked about in the Manchester United forward press. So now we've gone from having 4 Manchester City players against 3 Manchester United players to having a matched parity here of 3v3. The big question is then, where has the weakness emerged in that pressing system? And as we can see, that weakness is now here in the midfield area around the pivot players. So we have 2 pivot players for Manchester City, and then Manchester United only have Eriksen in this current shape. And it is important to note that in their deep build-up phase, Manchester City could use Ederson as a de facto centre-back as well. And so what you've done now is introduce another weakness in this deeper build-up phase. That would disappear as they move down the field. But in this situation now, you can see that we've got 4 Manchester United players and 6 Manchester City players in the deep build-up phase. That means that Manchester City are going to find it very easy to move the ball around the pitch. What we've seen from Manchester City a lot this season is borrowing ideas from Roberto De Zerbi and using third-man combinations to get through lines of pressure. So in this instance here, what you might have is Stones dropping in, pulling Eriksen towards him, getting the pass from Diaz, and then playing an immediate pass through to Rodri, then a bounce pass. And what we have now is Rodri in space with the ball at his feet. He's through that line of first pressure, and now you're in a lot of problem if you're Manchester United, because if Rodri carries the ball, one of these 2 midfielders has to come. Whichever one comes, then there's a pass through then to Gundogan in this instance, and now you've got the back line at your mercy. So in this sort of situation, by giving Manchester City the overload in the build-up phase, they're just going to build through the middle quite comfortably. Now you may think, well, why not solve this problem by making sure that weakness doesn't exist around the pivots, and that's a good way of playing. So let's say Eriksen goes on Rodri, now we have Stones being marked by Fred. The problem is that we've now moved that weakness in the press into a deeper area again. So now we have Gundogan and De Bruyne up against Casemiro. And again, in this sort of situation, you would still expect Manchester City to be very good at building the ball through the centre. And if they do get through the middle, then you have 2 players on 1. And again, you're in the same sort of situation. Now, again, you might say, well, let's solve that problem by pushing a player up from a deeper line, solving this weakness further up the pitch. But what you're doing is you're just pushing that weakness somewhere else. So let's imagine that Casemiro comes across to Gundogan. We have a system where the 2 centre-backs are going to be ready to jump on the number 8. What you've done is you've ended up in the same situation here, which is 1v1 across the back line, and you're probably going to end up with problems trying to keep Haaland quiet, especially in this amount of space. And so the big question ahead of the FA Cup final is, where is Erik Ten Hag going to allow that weakness to exist in his pressing structure so that Manchester City don't get the upper hand? And if we've learned anything from Erik Ten Hag this season, it's that he doesn't like that weakness to exist in the back line of his pressing structure. He doesn't like to have players 1v1. He likes to have a buffer player who can offer that extra protection at the back. And so that means that weakness needs to come nearer the front of his pressing structure. So is there another solution here? And in fact, there actually is, and it was proposed by none other than Wayne Rooney. Now, the thing that Wayne Rooney has noticed about Manchester City is that their new shape actually has them with a box midfield in this central space, and that means they're going to overwhelm most other teams who only have 3 midfielders. So as you can see, Manchester United's current shape is that they have these 3 midfielders. And so Wayne Rooney's solution to this is that rather than allowing the weakness to exist in the pressing structure in this area to have a 3 versus 4 overload in favour of Manchester City, what he's going to do is he's going to take one of the players out of the forward line of the press and drop them in a little bit deeper. And so what we've ended up with here is actually much closer to a 4-4-2. But rather than being a standard 4-4-2, what we've actually ended up with is midfielders in these 2 spaces because they're going to help out in central areas. Now that means that we need to have a bit of a personnel change. So what we see is actually Fred being pushed up into this more advanced area because he's a really good out of possession player. Let's get rid of Eriksen, and we're going to bring in a bit more of a defensive midfielder in this sort of area now. So we'll bring in McTominay as one of the other 6s. Well, what we've done here is we've actually solved a couple of problems. The first problem that we've solved is that in this front line now, we've introduced that weakness again. So we've got 2 Manchester United players against 3 Manchester City players. We've reintroduced that weakness back into the front line. And the solution that is offered is that we now have a much better situation in the middle. We've got 4 Manchester United players around 4 Manchester City players. And then again, everywhere else, we've got the situation that Erik Ten Hag likes. We've got an extra player around Haaland here. So let's just have a think about what this looks like in build-up. So we've already said that in the deepest phases, Manchester City can form a situational back 4 with their goalkeeper taking up one of the centre-back spots. Now the important thing to notice here is that these 2 forwards are stopping the ball from getting through to the pivot players. Now the big temptation is going to be for this player to jump up onto the goalkeeper with the ball, and what we've already said is that Manchester City will have these get-outs using third man combinations so they can play the ball around here. So what we need from these two players in the forward press of Manchester United is lots of patience, not making sure that they're jumping up too much. But in the situations where they do jump, we now have these in-between players in the wide areas of the midfield. So we've got Fred and Fernandes, and they're going to play as two-way players because the weaknesses that are going to open out are either going to be through the middle if you jump and allow that pass through, in which case Fernandes can come across and make sure that the pivot player is covered. Or if you're going to be really passive, the obvious solution is to play into these wide areas. And now what we're going to see is we're going to see Fernandes moving across to make sure that the wide centre-back doesn't get a huge amount of scope to get the ball in those wide areas as we've already seen. Now in this situation, you'd expect the rest of the Manchester United team to drop across. So Fred would come and help out. Your forwards do have to drop in and help out defensively in these situations. But the idea then is that you've allowed the weakness to exist in the wide areas and you have a solution if the ball goes into those wide areas, because this central midfielder can pull across and everyone can match their players up player for player, and you've made it hard for Manchester City to build out. Now this is obviously a very conservative setup, but the idea is that rather than pressing in the final third here, you're going to wait for the ball to come to the middle third, press aggressively when the ball comes into you, and the idea then is that because you've got Rashford and Martial in these nice central spaces, if you do win the ball back quickly, then you have these really nice transitional moments where you can find those two forward players and you then hope that you can cause Manchester City some problems in transition. Since the Manchester derby in January, the trajectory of these two clubs has headed in different directions, and there's a lot of people who think that this final is a foregone conclusion in Manchester City's favour. But it's clear that Manchester United can also be the protagonists in this final, and with a few tweaks here and there, they can definitely cause Manchester City some problems.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.